Hi, I'm Jim and I was retired. I'm going to share the secret why I like my three bucket strategy rather than the version proposed by Morningstar's Christine Benz. In this week's video, I'll share why I believe my three bucket portfolio is better. Stay tuned. Now, I was reading this article this last week by Christine Benz on Morningstar, and she explains her approach to the bucket strategy for retirees. Hey, before I go any further, will you please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video with other DIY retirees if you like entertaining ideas from one DIY retiree to another. The bucket approach to building a retirement portfolio. Christine Benz, March 19, 2025. It notes that began interestingly enough with this reminiscing about the 70s with high CD rates. And I recall that my wife Marie remembers being told by her mom to hop into the car. They were going to go pick up a CD. Now, this was well before compact discs. This was back when tapes, 8-track, and cassette were the big thing, not CDs. So what was a CD? They went to the bank and bought a certificate of deposit to lock in these high interest rates that were prevalent in the late 70s and early 80s. For a long time, you couldn't get those kind of CD rates on savings for your bucket one. Rates have come back up, she notes, and then she talks about her approach to the strategy. The all-important bucket one, the linchpin of any bucket framework, is a highly liquid component to meet near-term living expenses for 1 year or more. Bucket one is by no means a return engine, but the goal of this portfolio sleeve is to stabilize the principal to meet income needs not covered by other income sources. To arrive at the amount of money to hold in bucket one, start by sketching out spending needs on an annual basis. You need a budget. I know there are some that don't like budgeting, but you need to know what your detailed expenses are in retirement. Subtract the amount any certain non-portfolio sources of income, such as Social Security or a pension. So in my case, I have a pension, a small pension that helps meet expenses. So my portfolio bucket one now needs to think about what withdrawals I need to make to help meet expenses for the next 3 years. I use 3 years. Conservative investors may want to multiply that figure by 2. Again, I use 3 to determine cash holdings. And it's cash and equivalents. We'll get back to that a little bit. Alternatively, investors concerned about the opportunity cost might consider a 2-part liquidity pool. 1 year of living expenses in true cash. And in my case, I have 1 year of the withdrawals that I need to make from portfolio for expenses in the bank. The next 2 years are a mixture of taxable and tax-deferred cash equivalents that I've lined up for those expenses. A retiree might also consider including an emergency fund in bucket one to defray unanticipated expenses. And again, normal run-of-the-year expenses are in my bucket one. If I get in a really serious pinch, I can draw on tax-free resources to meet a budget need. But bucket one is where you should have all of the expenses, including the surprise expenses. So your emergency bucket in general should be in that first 3 years of expenses that you want to draw down. Here she gets into bucket 2 and beyond. And although retirees may customize different frameworks for the number of buckets they hold and the type of assets in each, my model bucket portfolios include 2 additional buckets. So bucket 2 in her framework, the portfolio segment contains 5 to 8 years worth of living expenses. And again, in my case, it's 5 years worth of living expenses after the first 3 that are in there in income producing assets. They're there for stability and income producing. Thus, there can be equity in bucket 2 if it's income producing, high quality dividend paying equities. Income distributions from this portion of the portfolio can be used to refill bucket 1 as those assets are depleted. Again, you're withdrawing them for your expenses. Why not simply spend the income proceedings directly and skip bucket 1 altogether? Because you're queuing up what you need for those 3 years. Because most retirees desire a reasonably consistent income stream to help meet their income needs. If yields are low, the retiree can maintain a consistent standard of living by looking to other portfolio sources, such as rebalancing proceeds from bucket 2 and 3 to fill bucket 1. And bucket 3 is the longest term portion of the portfolio. Bucket 3 is dominated by stocks and more volatile bond types such as junk bonds. I have mostly equity in my bucket 3 approach. Because this portion of the portfolio is likely to deliver the best long-term performance, it will require periodic trimming to keep the total portfolio from becoming too equity heavy. By the same token, this portion of the portfolio will also have a much greater loss potential than buckets 1 and 2. And so when bucket 3 is down, you have buckets 1 and 2 to draw upon. But when bucket 3 is up, you have the ability to refill buckets 2 and 1 and use that for expenses. The bucket structure calls for adding assets back to bucket 1 as the cash is spent down. Yet investors can exercise a lot of leeway to determine the logistics of that necessary bucket maintenance. And this is why I'm now 9 years into my DI retiree, and I've maintained the bucket strategy because of this flexibility, the strategic flexibility that you have with this bucket approach. I can use income from cash holdings in bucket 1. I can use the income from bonds and dividend paying stocks in bucket 2 and possibly even bucket 3. My equity in bucket 3 also produces some dividends. And you can also use proceeds from rebalancing to fill up bucket 2 and 3 if things get top heavy in bucket 1. And again, that's where my portfolio by buckets that considers 3 time buckets and 3 tax buckets helps. And I'll show you. Now, I've updated this sample portfolio by buckets spreadsheet for 2025, and I'll zip this and include it on my Google Drive for those of you on numbers. And I will try to translate it into sheets. There are some kinks in that, as that video describes. But here's the numbers version, and let me give you a tour of it. Now, I've made some feature enhancements in the last year or so, so I've included this in the sample. And one of them is the ability to sort your fixed income by their maturity date. And when you import the data from Quicken, you also, or any other aggregator you use or download from the broker themselves, keep in mind the structure of the names. And in here, I've highlighted some things. You need to make sure, if you've got a rule here about the date of maturity is drawing from date value right with that number of characters, then your name has to include that. So that means you have to be uniform in the way you draw your dates. So you want to make sure you adjust this. If they're using 2029, you want to change it to just 29. And if they put US after a security, you might want to go in there and adjust it like this. That won't let the sort by maturity work. When you've sorted this by the date of maturity, and in all cases, then sorts it that way. And that allows you to, when you categorize, show a chart over here that includes a representation of the ladder of fixed income securities, treasuries, CDs that I have queued up for the next few years. And again, this sample data is a little over 1.5 million total asset for the couple for their retirement needs. And then down here, it uses some ifs to give you the asset allocations by asset mixture, stock, international stock, REITs, domestic bonds, TIPS, treasuries, I bonds, CDs, cash, if you want to keep them separate, or you can just lump that together as cash. And then it comes down here to this next section of assigning the mixtures, taking that asset mixture and drawing it down into US stock and domestic bond so that you can sort this. All of this happens to give you an overall asset allocation. In this case, the person is very close to a 60-40 split. And then it has this little table here that shows how much you have to adjust to bring it into perfect alignment with your target allocation. And keep in mind, I'm aiming for a 70-30. You would just copy these numbers here and put it into your target allocation, and it would automatically show you how much cash you have to move to bring it in alignment with your target. So on the overview charts page, I've moved this CAGR calculations, compounded annual growth rate, which is the way I've looked, smoothing out an average annual return into something a little bit more refined for my approach. Then I've added this table down here to say if average expenses for this couple were $115,000 and they had a pension income of $40,000, and again, this is similar to the scenario that I've shared in the last few videos, then they're going to require $75,000 in required withdrawals from the portfolio. And that gives you, under the 3 buckets strategy, this little table down here that says, okay, if that's the case, then you've got $54,000 too much in bucket 1, and it can be redeployed into bucket 2 and bucket 3. That allows you to create these charts then of the 3 time buckets, the asset allocation within the time buckets, and the time buckets by tax buckets. And over here, the 3 tax buckets in this sample portfolio. So this model couple with the sample data that I've dummied up has a little bit less tax-free and opportunity to do more Roth conversions to beef up that number as they move forward in their retirement. 9 years plus into my retirement, I'm about double that in the tax-free pie. So bucket 1 is taxable and tax deferred. Bucket 2 is also tax deferred and taxable. And bucket 3 is a combination of mostly tax deferred, some taxable, and some tax free in this model portfolio. So that's my managing by buckets with 3 time buckets and 3 tax buckets. Now, here is why I like my bucket system better. They use these red solo cups and green solo cups to talk about the 3 time buckets as well as the 3 tax buckets in my 3 bucket portfolio. I'll show you and explain. So like Christine Benz, I have a 3 bucket system for time buckets. Bucket 1 is for assets that will need to be drawn down for expenses over the next 3 years. Bucket 2 is for assets that I'll need to withdraw for the equivalent of 5 years after that. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then bucket 3 is for all of the assets that I don't need to touch for at least 9 years. 9 years and on is where I put bucket 3, long-term investments. But my bucket system also includes green Solo cups in honor of St. Patty's Day, I guess. Taxable, tax deferred, and tax-free accounts. Now, here's the reason why I like my system better than Christine Benz. In my system, with these time buckets and tax buckets, if you're ever concerned about what's happening in bucket 2 and bucket 3, you just take your bucket 1 red Solo cup and pour yourself a Guinness into your bucket 1 and enjoy. I will conclude with my standard warning. I have no initials after my name, so take these as entertaining ideas from one educated consumer to another. Always do your own due diligence and seek out a professional if you need one.